special ed housing units for veterans in prisons and jails. My name is Kerwin Henderson. I'm a research associate here at American University with the Justice Programs Office. On behalf of our office and behalf of the VJ Technical Assistance Drug Court Project, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. I know today a lot of people have been asking about, and a lot of preparation has gone into it. So I'd like to thank you for joining us on this webinar. So I just want to fill you in on a few housekeeping items before we get started. If you experience any technical difficulties joining the WebEx session, please dial 1-866-779-3239, or you can message the WebEx producer using the question and answers panel. During the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode, and as a reminder, the event is being recorded for rebroadcast. So during the webinar, we encourage you to submit written questions at any time during the presentation using the questions and answer panel located at the bottom right hand of your screen. After typing your questions in the space at the bottom, hit the send button, and please be sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the Ask menu. Your questions will not be seen by other members of the audience and will be addressed, time permitting, toward the end of the session. The session will be about an hour for the presentation and about half an hour at the end for questions and answers. I see a number of people have called in too. So to ask a question verbally, please use the raise hand feature located at the bottom right hand of the participants panel. Your line will be unmuted and you will be introduced to ask a question verbally. After asking your question, you can click on the hand icon again to lower your hand. At various intervals, polling questions will appear on the screen. Please take a moment to select your answers and then click the submit button to share your response. Results will be shared in a confidential format after the poll is closed. So without much further ado, Warden Randall Liberty and Major Evan Simone, we'll let them go ahead and begin. Thank you.
Well, we sincerely appreciate your taking the time to be with us to address this issue, which is it's a growing trend in the country and worthy of exploration. And this is certainly only a beginning, but it's somewhere to start and already some lessons to learn. He said major. It's true, I'm a major in the reserve component, but as I speak to you today, I'm speaking from an entirely personal perspective based on my research and just my interest in this area. So it's pretty fair to say that the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense don't endorse what I'm saying, and it certainly isn't their own positions, their official positions. You have maybe four basic primary missions, if we want to use the military vernacular, in conducting this webinar. First, we want to appreciate the fact that this is a phenomenon across the country, and just to try to get an idea of how many states are experimenting with this notion of specialized housing units for persons with military experience. We also want to understand the benefits, especially in this day and age of shrinking budgets and the need to conserve resources. How does a veterans dorm approach answer that? Next, we want to focus on the fact that these programs can and do, and they are, addressing mental health conditions related to combat service and the special concerns that arise in incarcerated settings for individuals with combat stress and other mental health conditions. But it's important at the same time to recognize severe limitations. For example, that the Department of Veterans Affairs will not and cannot, under law, provide direct health care services during the period of incarceration. So how do we approach that? What are the limitations, and what is realistic to expect in terms of addressing these mental health concerns? And then finally, we want to take a look at the relationship between veterans treatment courts and veterans dorms, and the idea that together, both of these programs, especially when there's an interplay between them, can actually contribute to a comprehensive approach to veterans in the criminal justice system and respond to some major needs that we're seeing after these sustained years of combat operations. So first thing we're going to do is do that snapshot I think it's important for us to look at history also, and to recognize that even though there may be comments out there that the first dorm program was established in 2010, or maybe even that it was inspired by the Veterans Treatment Courts in Buffalo in 2008, that historically there have been programs, and those programs have taught various lessons, and so we don't want to forget about history here. And then there's basically 6. If we look across all the different programs, there's really 6 objectives for instituting specialized housing units in prisons and jails. And we really want to convey the message that depending on the specific objective for instituting these programs, that is going to shape the way in which they're operated. It may even shape eligibility. And it's important to really recognize what are the goals in instituting these programs. And then there are really at least 11 characteristics of these programs that can be added on to the general idea that enable specific objectives to be accomplished, and it's worth paying some attention to those. Finally, again, we'll be talking about the relationship to Veterans Treatment Courts. So as we move forward to the current snapshot, it's important to start out. This is Judge Oliveira. I'm sure many of you may have seen this. It was covered nationally. On April 23rd, 2016, this Veterans Treatment Court judge, in using graduated sanctions in the Veterans Treatment Court program, had a participant named Joe Serna who had combat trauma, who was not being honest about drug use and had lied, and it was determined that he should spend some time in therapeutic incarceration, a day in jail, as a consequence of his failure to adhere to the program requirements. The judge was concerned, having himself been a veteran, that Mr. Serna's mental state really would not be conducive to confinement, that the certain aspects of being confined could actually exacerbate Mr. Serna's symptoms and actually perhaps even harm the progress of his treatment. So Judge Oliveira decided to stay in confinement with Mr. Serna for that 24-hour period to provide some kind of support and to try to mitigate the experience of incarceration. And the basic message here that comes across from this is that today there's a recognition that incarceration can have anti-therapeutic consequences, especially for people with high needs for treatment, especially veterans who've experienced combat trauma. And the notion is that is there something we can do about it? And certainly that's what this is all about. So it's important to recognize that this is a prominent question today. I created this slide. I can't take full credit for it because Jessica Blue Howells over at the Veterans Justice Outreach Program at the Department of Veterans Affairs was very kind to share data that they had gathered from an informal survey. And so while we might have different definitions for what a veteran's dorm is, and certainly some are called pods or wings or blocks, and there's really no criteria that are ironed out for exactly what constitutes a veteran's dorm. Their data and some of the research I conducted have led to this current snapshot, and hopefully that's available to you and you can blow it up and take a look at it. But it's quite interesting that we have 24 states, and nearly half the nation here has moved to this idea and is doing something in terms of specialized housing areas and programs for incarcerated veterans in confinement. Not all of these programs are similar. Certainly some have been developed in county jails by sheriffs who have much more freedom to design program attributes at a local level and can really do quite a bit. And that's one reason why it's so great to have Warden Liberty with us talking about what he did as the sheriff of Kennebec County in Maine in instituting his program. But it's noteworthy that 2 federal correctional institutes have specialized housing units for veterans. And we can find them in Florida and West Virginia. And it's quite interesting that Florida is a state that has all three. It has county jails, it has state prisons, and it has a federal correctional institution, all of which are implementing these programs. So I would commend this to your attention and suggest to you that right now there are lessons being learned. And right now, for veterans treatment courts that aren't working hand in hand with these programs, it's important to realize that there is definitely a resource that can be used to enhance those programs, especially when a veteran is not eligible for diversion in a veterans treatment court, but could benefit from the specialized housing unit. So this is just a brief overview, probably a good way to start. And on the next page, you have the names of the institutes where these programs are being implemented for your reference. An idea here is, and I use the term purpose-driven incarceration because I heard Warden Liberty had mentioned it earlier as one of the fundamental concepts that define his program in Kennebec County. And the idea here is that purpose-driven incarceration, it's a movement, and it doesn't only deal with veterans. If we look across the board today, what we can see are specially tailored programs with segregated housing so that inmates who have the same needs or the same goals and objectives can work together to achieve them with support from one another and more of a liberty or freedom to actually work in the area that deals with their goals. So we have fatherhood dorms, and I know that Muskogee County, Georgia, is really taking off with this, and the idea is that you want to help fathers connect with their children, really exemplify the purpose of being role models for their children, even though they have a criminal record, even though they're incarcerated, and they bring in community members to talk about what it means to be a father and to share different ideas. You have GED dorms for those inmates who want to work on educational development, and you have faith-based dorms, which again bring people together who have similar interests in practicing their faith and using that as a tool to recover. And so the whole idea is, whether we're talking about veterans dorms or fatherhood dorms or GED dorms, you want to create a supportive environment in which inmates are motivated to address the sorts of underlying problems that they have. You want to improve the quality of programming for those inmates by consolidating resources from outside the institution, which ultimately will reduce recidivism. So these are some of the main characteristics of purpose-driven incarceration, and I would suggest to you that just like we have this idea of problem-solving courts as one approach to deal with underlying issues and criminal involvement, that purpose-driven incarceration is the alternative, and it should be viewed in the same light in that comprehensive approach to dealing with underlying problems. When we talk about veterans, there's really three major benefits of housing them in specialized housing units. First, the issues in dealing with trauma, the effect of trauma, especially those with post-traumatic stress and other conditions, really they need a safe and trusting environment to address their symptoms, to address their triggers, and to really explore their conditions and how they're responding in confinement. And when they have that, when there's a safe and trusting environment, much more can be accomplished in the general population where there is often a lack of that sense of some level of safety. Also, something very unique to veterans is their military culture, their training, their work as team members with a sense of accountability to one another as part of a community working towards a common goal. And quite frankly, that's probably one of the main attributes that makes veterans far more able to succeed when they're working together and given that common purpose. And to hear it described in places like the New York State Correctional Services DRTP program, they don't want to let each other down. They realize that they have something important and that it's not something that's available to all inmates, and so they want to help each other as a way of supporting the high standards of the program and ensuring that this avenue of obtaining treatment and addressing their issues still remains. And finally, we have this idea of increasing responsibility. And we're going to talk later about cadre roles and leadership roles within these dorms, but certainly the ability to have these leadership positions and to exercise that responsibility definitely translates over to responsibility for improving their own life situation. And I give you the quote from the Veterans Residential Treatment Program in New York. It's quite long, and I'm not going to read it here, but it really does exemplify why, for veterans specifically, a specialized housing approach has tremendous value. Other important considerations for instituting veterans dorms: we're concentrating veterans in the same location, which permits outside organizations to more effectively deliver these veteran-specific services. And certainly, maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, but to have multiple organizations come and try to get visitation with veterans saying, we're here to see the veterans, we're here on behalf of this organization, it can become very taxing for administering the correctional objectives. So to consolidate and streamline services for your veterans who have similar needs actually contributes to the effective operation of the facility and minimizes disruption. Cost efficiency, we're going to talk later. One of the most interesting things is that almost all the tools that are needed for a successful veterans dorm are already available in a correctional institute. And so the funding issue, especially with the tapping into local public organizations who are concerned about veterans, you really are able to save a tremendous amount of funding as you reduce recidivism and meet correctional objectives. And then full participation without distraction from the general population. I'll give you an example here. I recall reading about two veterans, and both of them had PTSD, and both of them were confined. And through these programs, they were able to really participate in being in the present through breathing techniques and relaxation techniques. And the way they were able to do this is, while one of them engaged in meditation and other breathing techniques, the other one would watch his back literally and ensure that no one would be approaching him and that he would have that space, and then they would rotate. But the idea is, this is the kind of reality we're dealing with, and if breathing techniques really do work, which they do in dealing with triggers and what can be called the wild ride of being triggered, then why not enable that to happen? We also, number 4 here, just like the other specialized housing units, veterans dorms enable better detection of behavioral changes and needs by correctional staff and fellow participants. So you're much more able to in real time see changes in behavior, and especially when other inmates are alerted to use their chain of command and actually bring that to the attention of persons who can assist. And then increasing officer safety and limiting officer stress. Consistently, accounts of veterans specialized housing units, whether it's in jails or prisons, we start to learn that correctional officers and deputies actually want to to work there. They want to do those rounds because it's less stressful, because there's more respectful attitudes. They can expect fewer disciplinary infractions, and so it becomes desirable to actually work with inmates in those environments. And when we talk about having resources that already exist and not having to devote extensive funding and planning, people who administer these programs call them strategic justice investments and a logical first step to reduce costs, meeting the goals of realignment, as have also been mentioned. And the reason why is everything you need is really there. You have inmate peer counselors, correctional officers or sheriff's deputies with prior military experience, inmates who have amazing skills. I'm sure everyone's aware of this, who can create murals and design uniforms or other features of the program that are common to these programs. And then veteran mentors from community organizations who are willing to come into the institution and participate. So the real idea here is, with the appropriate structure and with specific goals in mind, and we should definitely recognize that not all programs will have the same exact goals, setting up a program will not be as difficult as trying to address this from other perspectives. So a bit about history. I wanted to chart this according to the timeline of significant impacts affecting incarcerated veterans. And it really begins shortly after the end of World War I. And in 1921, the first iteration of the VA actually came about, and they called it the Veterans Bureau. And around the time frame of 1922, there was a tremendous interest in World War I veterans who were combat traumatized and were confined as a result of their mental health conditions. And there were reports of 20,000 incarcerated World War I veterans. Actually, the number was estimated to be quite higher across the country, and a demand for action to address this. And from one of those early reports in a newspaper in the 20s, this is a direct quote, you learn about the position of the first iteration of the Department of Veterans Affairs. The U.S. Veterans Bureau feels that this prison work is part of their job and that their responsibility will not be fulfilled until they have satisfied themselves that there are no men confined in penal institutions in this country who are there as a direct or indirect result of their sacrifices to this country. My, how the times have changed. But I think it's really important. This was called the Great American Prison Cleanup. Just for your historical knowledge, it began in Wisconsin. The governor there became concerned about this. Psychiatrists got involved, and they started doing inventories of each of the inmates with stenographers and examining them and trying to determine the cause of any mental health concerns or physical concerns that landed them in confinement. And the American Legion joined forces with these groups, and it spread like wildfire across the country. And I included one article from the 1920s from the American Legion magazine just to show you how real this was. It's a forgotten lesson, but an important piece of it, and this is the article I'm providing to you, The Lost Legion from 1923. The article recommends a way to deal with combat traumatized veterans in confinement is to put them in specialized housing units with certain liberties in employment, custodial care, and supervision so that they can get attention for the issues that bring them there. And that's pretty startling because that is what we're seeing now, and it ties into this idea that nothing is new about veterans involved with the criminal justice system. What we're really dealing with is an expected response to war and combat operations and the tolls that it takes even on those who return and essentially bring the war back. But historically, this has been a concern just as it is today. So there are lessons if we're willing to look for them. Later on, and I think this is important also, you had veteran service organizations very supportive of World War II veterans. States established veterans counselors in prisons and jails. I've given you a publication from 1940s where the Indiana State Farm at Greencastle began a short-term incarceration project to help assist veterans who were incarcerated for similar reasons. And what they really called this is it's basic training in how to be a civilian again. And that was their approach to this, specialized housing unit for veterans in 1946. And the VA also began formalized outreach programs, although I will tell you that in the 50s, some VA medical centers refused to provide care to convicted felons. As the 1960s approach, we see Vietnam and very public representations of criminally involved veterans as being on drugs and not being responsible. And we see distancing of these traditional veteran service organizations from veterans who are incarcerated. Very, very different from the earlier experience post-World War II. In some studies, they suggest that the idea was that they didn't want to associate the fighters from the greatest generation who went off and fought valiantly. They didn't want to start diluting their brand by focusing on assistance to veterans who were incarcerated during the Vietnam era, and we start to see this idea of lost legions arising. 1974, General Accountability Office report indicated that over 80% of veterans never got any kind of information about their benefits when they were incarcerated, and many of them actually believed that because they had been incarcerated, they weren't entitled to any benefits. This, of course, is the 1946 article which I'm providing to you, which really is, again, an example of how historically the notion of specialized services through housing units for veterans has been something that has been recognized as an advantage. And as the timeline progresses, President Carter in 1978, this is very interesting, I found this out recently, the whole idea about the Bureau of Justice Statistics collecting information about incarcerated veterans, it came the same day as President Carter's address to the Congress, where he talked about various obstacles in assisting veterans who were incarcerated as part of the response to Vietnam veterans. In 1980, Congress started restricting various benefits for veterans. Most notably, they used to receive money payments for the GI Bill, and that was discontinued. They were not allowed to obtain money. The thought was that they would use it for nefarious purposes. And then after John Hinckley Jr. Attempted to assassinate President Reagan, there were a lot of reports after that about Hinckley trying to obtain GI Bill and other VA benefits while he was incarcerated, and this led to more legislation to limit benefits of incarcerated veterans. By 1986, Congress is clarifying that VA medical centers are not required to provide health care to incarcerated veterans. In 1989, we have something called the Incarcerated Veterans Rehabilitation and Readjustment Act, which was proposed to try to mandate that the VA would be providing direct health care services to combat traumatized veterans in federal prisons. There were a number of hearings on this. Very interesting information came from it, but it failed, and it largely failed because the VA itself explained that they did not want to prioritize incarcerated veterans for health care services when non-incarcerated veterans also needed health care. And in 1999, the Code of Federal Regulations, I'm sure you've all seen this, Section 17.38, created a bar on the VA providing any kind of direct health care services to incarcerated veterans on the basis that it would be a duplication of health care services that were already required by those correctional institutions. So we have a very rocky road where things just keep getting worse after Vietnam, starting in the 60s to the point where there have been significant limits. In 2002, outreach increases. We do have counselors from the Veterans Justice Outreach, Healthcare Reentry for Veterans. The VA has, of course, as I'm sure you all know, been very active in providing counseling services, even though they cannot today, under these rules, offer direct health care services. But this kind of explains how we got to the point where we are. I've reproduced President Carter's 8 major obstacles to incarcerated veteran outreach. My suggestion to you is that the same issues that were present in 1978 continue to be present today. It's interesting to consider the proposed findings of the law that did not ultimately pass, but these were the congressional findings that would have supported the 1989 Incarcerated Veterans Rehabilitation and Readjustment Act. Finding 1 is there are rehabilitation needs unique to veterans, which because of their incarceration need to be addressed. And finding 4 was incarcerated veterans treated for psychological readjustment problems can be expected to have lower recidivism rates than such veterans who do not receive such treatment. Even though this didn't pass, there was actually a scientific basis for this research and for the ultimate findings of Congress that were proposed. And a recommendation here to you is that these are still valid today. So historically, just so you know, there are various lessons to be drawn from specialized housing units for veterans and from approaches to meet the needs of combat traumatized and confined veterans from a historical perspective. The Indiana State Farm at Greencastle is perhaps the oldest. In 1977, before there were limitations on direct health care services to veterans, the Southern California Brentwood VA had a program called the VIP, Veterans in Prison Program, operated by Bruce Pentland. It did some fantastic things, and there was even talk about making that a model for prisons and jails across the country. But because of these policy concerns, that it did not take off the way it could have. For a short term, 2 years in the Federal Correctional Institute at Phoenix, psychologist Charles Sigafus implemented what he called the Second Tour program, which we're going to talk about shortly. And then because of a class action lawsuit raised in the 80s in Pennsylvania, dealing with the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, there was a program established called the PTSD treatment program that came from the case of Carter versus Jeffries, and we'll talk about that. I actually did include from the court records the memorandum in which the Department of Corrections outlined that the existence of that program and its objectives for combat traumatized Vietnam veterans. And then perhaps, and definitely it's worth noting, the longest running, which still runs today, although it's changed in its, in its setup over the years, the longest running specialized housing unit program for veterans is in New York with the Veterans Residential Therapeutic Program. So quickly, we'll talk about 6 objectives of specialized housing units for incarcerated veterans, and then the means to accomplish each one. There's basic themes here, and that box on the bottom highlights this. Although jail or prison can institute one of these programs for multiple reasons, program attributes often differ based on these specific objectives. So the first objective for instituting these programs can just be to promote successful readjustment to civilian status following a deployment. The second theme would be to address combat-related trauma and post-traumatic stress, specifically in recognition that symptoms can be exacerbated by the confinement experience. And then there's a third idea of addressing trauma primarily with some adaptability to veterans, but in recognition that that long-term, very detailed treatment may not be possible, especially in jails, to deal with trauma and try to stabilize the situation with some kind of veteran focus. Then another idea here and theme would be to prepare the veteran for community reentry, and then instill discipline or esprit de corps, and then finally to reward past military service. So certainly, and just as an example, if your goal is to address PTSD, if you wanted to instill discipline or esprit de corps and wanted to do that using a program that mimicked basic training or drill and ceremonies, that could actually be re-traumatizing to an individual. So these may not be compatible. Some of the program objectives can overlap, but really program attributes change. And we'll talk more about that. So when we talk about the second TOR model and the Indiana State Farm, the focus there is on readjustment from deployment, following deployment. And rather than a diversion from incarceration, these models operate on a captive audience model where you're basically recognizing that unless the person was confined, they really might not have the opportunity to evaluate their behavior and actually recognize how they're affected by their military training and deployments and what that has done and how to get back into a mode that is not for survival. And so it's an idea of maximizing the opportunity of confinement and using that time constructively. And the idea is also that by using predictable schedules that could very much resemble military training, that creates dedicated space and time to reevaluate one's behavior. Community mentors play a huge role in this. Their idea is not only do they meet a mentor while they're incarcerated to kind of help recognize differences in their approaches, but this continues, and there's actually continuing contact and guidance from mentors in the community following their release, which can certainly be vital, given that the first few days after release is really the most volatile period when inmates might be at risk of suicide or other harmful behavior. In addressing these, it's important to realize that screening for veteran status is not the only thing you want to do. You want to screen for combat experience and also try to understand the intensity of that combat experience so that the need for readjustment can be identified. And certainly, I mean, we're at a stage now where the main lesson is find out if someone has prior military service. Ask. And certainly that's an important goal, but it's not the only goal. There should also be a way to identify specific needs that arise based on aspects of military service. And that requires a bit more information to be collected. You know, you want to, for those combat veterans, you want to educate them that they've adopted a personal combat ready mode as a default to ensure their survival. And this mode traditionally overestimates threats and innately prioritizes survival from day to day, and that in a confined setting, even without knowing it, they will go into this mode, that it is likely they will go into this mode, and they should be understand how they have used that personal combat ready mode and what kind of indications they have of how it affects them. And you know, it may even be wise to see if you have contractors who have prior military experience, not just veterans who could benefit from this. But another key of this is Sigafoos talks about a squad orientation where they address issues as a group, and that organizing participants in a group that they may be used to from military training in a squad orientation will certainly help them in conducting this training and going through the process of learning readjustment. And I've given you a quote there from Sigafoos for your reading enjoyment. So the idea of the second tour, again, is that aspects of incarceration resemble military service in a combat zone. There's a number of ways listed there. And the environment revives familiar coping mechanisms of survival in that combat mode. And the second tour is defined as re-experiencing of a hostile environment in which it was necessary to rely on survivor skills to be able to exist. The way to address it is to acknowledge and examine similarities between criminal supervision, criminal confinement, and their own combat-ready mode. And this is different than things like battle mind or just understanding how veterans are trained, because it's focused on what happens in a confined setting specifically. When we talk about addressing PTSD, I really commend the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections model, the Southern California VIP program, and the FCI Phoenix models to you, because they tried to do that. And the idea here is to optimize contacts with the VA. Now, even though the VA cannot provide direct services, they can play a consulting role. And the notion is that one great thing that can be done is training inmates to become peer counselors for one another, to administer psychological first aid, which is not treatment, but rather to help stabilize situations. The slide is quite long, but it has some really good details. And the idea is always set a fixed time for completion of the program so that there's a motivation factor, but don't necessarily close it off then. It allow for extensions to complete the program. Another point from these programs is be very flexible. If someone's experiencing a symptom of PTSD, that should be sufficient to help them get specialized treatment, not necessarily a full-blown diagnosis. And we're learning that people with sub-threshold diagnoses have very acute needs as well. Maybe for short-term incarceration, and certainly I'd recommend this, the ideal is to stabilize rather than to treat, and to give veterans a sense of making meaning from their combat experiences. You really need programs that have a lot of time available to address that. Another idea from these programs is use a veterans group coordinator to streamline the delivery of services so that you can limit distractions and not have organizations appearing at once. There's a family dimension to be addressed with PTSD issues. And things to look for, this is an interesting slide here from this work by Stein and colleagues, because it really breaks out combat trauma into different variations, including moral injury. And certainly these are things to screen for, because it can give you more to work with in terms of addressing veteran-specific needs. And there's a definition of psychological first aid. Community reentry models are most popularized by Florida and Virginia prisons. A little bit different. The idea is that you are looking for a release date that's coming closer, and you allow eligibility and participation within a certain time from that release date, and you create an incentive. And, you try to link up veterans with counseling on their benefits within this time period as they're getting closer to release, so that you can better deliver the benefits. The important thing to realize here is that even though there's an attempt in the VA to reduce processing times, files take a long time to process, and being incarcerated only increases the amount of time for review and determination of benefits. So the timing may be off, and someone may be leaving without a decision that they even qualify as a veteran, especially based on their discharge characterization. So it's important to realize that may not benefit everyone, but it could benefit a number of people. Esprit de corps, really discipline focused. It's considered to be like a barracks behind bars, and this idea of a lived experience in common and reviving past pride. It can work. For traumatized individuals, it may not work as well, and it's important to recognize these distinctions. Rewarding past military service seems to be a very common goal here, but at the same time, there's an idea that if you're going to reward past service, it should be a good service, and if someone's less than honorably discharged, then some of those programs wouldn't want to bring those offenders into such an environment, so it could be limiting in that regard. The characteristics of veteran-specific programs at correctional institutions, well, there's 11 of them, and I just want to whiz through these for you so you can just see the different options that exist. Distinctive uniforms. These are photographs from Hagerstown, Maryland, at Roxbury Correctional Institute, where there are actual uniforms in terms of a polo shirt that participants that veterans who are in that program can use. The bars on the shoulder represent the number of years served in the military. You are able to indicate your name and the branch that you were with, and there's also on the back a memorial that they created that is exemplified in the uniform itself. And San Quentin, as another example, you have veterans distinguishing themselves through attire by wearing powder blue and white ball caps as a change to their standard uniform. In Florida's dorms, there are cards posted at each bed with a veteran's name, number of years of service, their branch, and a photograph. And the idea is that these uniforms give inmates a sense of ownership and control in their lives that is quite rare in a confined setting. Of course, they're not always wearing those uniforms. At Hagerstown, for example, they wear them during special occasions, during visitation with family members, etc. Awards for merit. Well, it's very similar to the military idea. They do have an elaborate series of awards at Hagerstown, and this is an example. Noteworthy, these are not awards that correspond to military awards they received when they served as veterans. Rather, these are awards that they received as part of contributions to the veterans program itself, whether it's for doing color guard events or for participating in community services or for writing letters for the newspaper. The polo shirts are updated over time to reflect the accumulation of these awards. And they permit inmates to be recognized for individual contributions within a group setting. I wanted to get out to Maryland to see their monument. It's one of only two monuments that exist in the country for that veterans built themselves. This one here was built with donated bricks, and it's quite elaborate, quite beautiful. They have the memorial plaque that's featured there, and along the walkway there are various additional plaques for each campaign. The Vietnam War is indicated in the example. There are other places. Michigan's Muscogee Correctional Facility has a monument, and in the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, Camp F has an immobilized armored personnel carrier that was donated by one of the wardens and then built up to museum-like standards by the inmates. Cadre and leadership positions are also quite important. The formalized leadership structure allows for responsibility. And I've given you an example of the 10 different pod responsibilities in New York that you can look at. Military regimens, again, for the esprit de corps and instilling discipline models, drill and ceremony, and having beds dress right dress, and having uniforms in a proper way. These aspects can be very, very motivating. But you don't necessarily have to go full-blown. Even for traumatized individuals, there could be aspects of military regiments. You could have terminology like companies and squads, and even verbal or written pull-ups to signify, remedial behavior. Also veteran-focused and military-focused work duties. The Virginia dorms have names affiliated with military service, so hazmat team members clean up the waste. The sergeant at arms monitors neatness of clothing. The inspiration coordinator provides inspiring military quotes to the group. Maryland has programs where inmates train service dogs from the time they're puppies to ultimately assist wounded warriors in the community, which can be a highly motivational experience. Maryland also has a program where incarcerated veterans can work in the community in VA cemeteries and ultimately gain skills for a later transition to a job by doing that after their release. In Chicago, in the Cook County jail, veterans actually replaced the laundry contract, saving a great amount of money on that contract by doing the laundry services. And they could be trusted. They had built the kind of relationship in the organization where they could carry out objectives, and they were used with duties and recognized with the ability to do duties for the entire institution. Public service within and beyond institutional walls. This is the Mark Stiles unit in Texas, where you have an actual color guard. The idea is that when you have an organization that develops where inmates can do things to serve the community, color guards can be used for GED graduations. For non-veterans, it becomes much more serve the entire inmate population. And then military-themed illustrations, flagged and seals. There's many ways to do it. I've given you examples from all over, and many of them now are even better than this. I mean, it's just so varied, but it's the environment itself changes to become motivational and has a tremendous impact. In San Diego County Sheriff's Department for the jail, if we look at the top image of a pod that has it's just a standard pod, but then look at what was done below with a veterans pod, that in and of itself can do a tremendous amount to change the environment and make it more conducive to the goals of the program. Visits from veterans and veteran mentors in the community. Again, I've given you various examples here, but since 1946 with Indiana's program, it's been recognized that this is truly a tremendous value. And if we think about what makes veterans treatment courts so successful with veteran mentors, it's the same idea. And it's been called battle buddies in places like Oklahoma, but having that connection back to the community from people who've been through similar experiences and have made it makes a tremendous difference. And then specific values-based standards of conduct. One thing we keep hearing from these programs is the fact that the veterans involved in them are often more responsible and far more disciplined than other veterans. And certainly that may come from their experience of having served in the military environment, but the notion is that a lot more is expected of them than other inmates. And certainly if we look at programs that exist, specialized housing units, we see that there are explicit rules they have to follow. One of them being confidentiality of information shared within groups. And I believe I've included a contract that has to be signed where they know they can be eliminated from the program if they start talking about other people's business. It's important to consider that that's another very salient feature of these programs. Our last slide here talks about the symbiotic relationship between veterans dorms and veterans treatment courts. And I know that we're going to lead right into Warden Liberty, who can tell you more about that from his own experiences. But the idea here, and here you have a picture of Erie County's jail dorm. It was created after the Veterans Treatment Court. In center stage, you have Judge Russell, who is so known for creating the Buffalo Veterans Treatment Court program, but you also have the sheriff as well. And it's recognized that the Erie County dorm was a direct outgrowth of the Buffalo Veterans Treatment Court program. And then you have other areas like Jefferson County, Missouri, where the sheriff actually approached a local judge and created that. So without any further delay, I want to switch now into the presentation of Warden Liberty so that we can address an actual example from a county jail where a dorm was created. Warden Liberty.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here to speak with you today, and I appreciate the attention that is being placed on this very important topic. During the next few minutes, I'll be talking about the journey that my staff and I took in establishing our veterans block, and I'm in sort of a unique position because I've been in law enforcement for 34 years. 26 of that I was in at the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office, 5 as the chief, and 9 as the sheriff. I simultaneously had a career in the Army Reserve, Army National Guard, where I served as a military policeman, a drill instructor. I taught at West Point for a few years, and I also, as you see in this first slide, I was on a 10-man team. We were embedded with 772 Iraqi infantrymen, and we went down into Fallujah. We fought with the 1st Marine Division in 2004. So I have this perspective not only from an individual that ran a correctional facility for 14 years as chief and sheriff, but also as an infantryman that served in combat and knows the sacrifices of our young American men and women. In the next slide, you'll see that we established the block in 2010. It was a response to a growing awareness of police-involved veterans. During that time frame in 2010-11, we observed there were 5 police-involved shootings and suicides, homicides, and it really brought home the fact that we need to address this issue in a collaborative way. The next slide, you'll see that the initial objectives were to determine just how many incarcerated veterans we had at that time. I was concerned with the county system. And so we began measures to count them at intake and establish that baseline number. It was also important for us to bring stakeholders in to get buy-in and see what resources we had available to us in the Central Maine area to see what we had for resources. Also, we looked at national trends, and also important to train our law enforcement partners as they had first contact with these individuals in the community and create some awareness, education, and diversion where we were able to do that. We also wanted to provide centralized housing for veterans as we could have efficient delivery of services. We were the first, and we continue to be the only veterans block in the state of Maine, in Central Maine. As you'll see that in the next slide, the veterans block, as with many of you in your jurisdictions, constrained budgets had to be no cost, low cost. We had to be efficient with what we had for resources. We had to be able to verify the status of the veteran, and we were able to do that with a collaboration with the Veterans Administration, TOGAS, and they allowed their community service advocate to spend time with us, verify through DD Form 214s to verify, in fact, they were veterans. They had deployed. They may or may not have service connection. That was important. We also went on a bit of a campaign to get community buy-in and gain legislative support. And we worked in collaboration with the Criminogenic Addiction Recovery Academy, a program that's focused on criminogenic thinking, and substance abuse. The co-occurring disorder court was co-located with us, which made it very useful in the establishment of a Veterans Court with Justice Nancy Mills later on. We had to serve the entire state of Maine because, again, we're the sole housing unit, and so we opened up that block to all. And as importantly, as was previously mentioned by the Major, important for us because we house inmates up to 9 months that are sentenced, that we provide stabilization, mental health services, transitional services with the Veterans Administration, vet centers, and others. Next slide will indicate that in the beginning, we began to collect the data from the veterans at intake. We established that relationship with Togus VA, and we received the 214s. We began to modify a 12-man block and build stakeholders. The 12-man block was unique. We had an older facility at the time, and it was linear in design, and it allowed us to have the flexibility. We had anywhere from 2-man to 22-man blocks, and so we could modify, expand, and contract the program according to the need without wasting bed space. The stakeholders that we ended up collaborating with were Crisis of Counseling and NAMI. They were doing the mental health portion of the programming. Togus VA, Veteran Centers did transitional, and some, as was mentioned previously, the Veterans Administration is limited to what they can provide for services, but they can certainly come in and provide information of eligibility for programming upon release. The law enforcement piece concerned diversion and the crisis intervention team training, the ability to work with these veterans and enhance their ability to understand post-traumatic stress, the signs and symptoms, and traumatic brain injury. We had to bring in the judiciary, obviously, as a major stakeholder, and we are fortunate in the Central Maine area to have Justice Nancy Mills, who has a big heart for veterans, and she collaborated with our district attorney, the legislature, the Maine Military Community Network. That's our umbrella organization in the state of Maine, bringing in all veterans advocacy groups together under one organization to collaborate and find and identify unmet needs for our veterans. We brought in the Maine Army National Guard, which has a large presence in the state of Maine. We brought Veterans Mentors of Maine, which is critically important, bringing veterans into the block, allowing the veterans to speak to other veterans, speak the same language, and other advocacy groups such as the VFW, the American Legion, and of course the Maine Bar Association, which was a major provider of the inmates, of the offenders to our block. Law enforcement education was critically important, as I mentioned. We established a 3-hour curriculum for law enforcement officers, and we did a traveling roadshow to educate the individuals on military culture, traumatic brain injury, post-traumatic stress, and we brainstormed with the leadership and the folks working the road to determine what we could do to collaborate, divert those that could be diverted, and keep them from incarceration. I had one scenario where I went into the correctional facility one morning, and as I did every morning, to identify if we had any veterans in-house. An individual had called in a complaint. He had had a flashback, thought he had been stabbed, when in actuality he hadn't. And when the officer arrived, rather than seeing him with a tight haircut, standing at parade rest, yes sir, no ma'am, that kind of language, and identifying those obvious cues that he was a veteran, he was arrested for filing a false or public report. Those are the sorts of things that we were able to avoid down the road with the identification of these law enforcement officers. Another outreach technique that we used was we collaborated with Maine Public Broadcasting, Jennifer Rooks and Charlie Stewart, who directed the documentary, and it's called A Matter of Duty. And it can be obtained online if you Google Maine Public Broadcasting, A Matter of Duty. This documentary is actually online. You can watch it. It's an hour-long piece, and it explains the journey that we took establishing the Veterans Block, the participation in the Veterans Court, and how that worked. So Maine Public Broadcasting, A Matter of Duty, has been a wonderful tool. I've been able to travel and educate and work with veterans and veterans advocacy groups, and they could see firsthand the journey that I took when I came back. I was a bit changed from my experience in Fallujah, and it follows the story of 4 incarcerated individuals, some with good results, some not. But it's a good tool that you and your folks could use to help you in the planning process. The next slide indicates that the places that I actually presented this was at most of the Maine universities. Nice forum to bring veterans and advocacy groups in. I also presented to the Maine legislature to get buy-in from the legislative folks. It was on Maine Public Broadcasting many times. I was able to present to the National Maine Sheriff's Association Conference, National Jail Association, and throughout the communities. And that really brought some resources in, heightened the awareness for our veteran community, and the awareness that individuals transitioning back from combat not only impact the individual that deployed, but it's a family affair, and how do we care for the families also. In the next block, next slide, you'll see that we established the Veterans Block, created a screening and a verification through 214s, and our integrated healthcare provider, Crisis and Counseling, developed healthcare programming. We also brought in the Peer Mentors of Maine, and they did that peer mentorship that's so important and so effective. We brought in acupuncture individuals, and there was some nice therapeutic results from that. As I said, the VA brought in the Criminal Justice Liaison. Veterans Center provided some counseling, but a different standard from the Veterans Administration. And we also brought in the Maine Humanities, brought in a Veterans Book Club, and we had a Maine Pretrial Services had a veteran transitional individual assigned to the block, and it provided for really smooth transitional programming. In the next slide, you'll see that we established it. It was established legislatively after already being established in practice. The legislature brought in, they made it part of the Co-occurring Disorder Court, which allowed us to not require much in the way of additional funds. It was a subsect of that court, and the way that we did it is when the Co-occurring Disorder Court met every Monday, the Veterans Court met earlier in the day, and they had their own private audience with the judge and the staff, and that worked well. Justice Nancy Mills, as I mentioned, was profoundly important to the Veterans Court, and as been previously mentioned, it's a critical component to have the Veterans Court and the Veterans Blocks working together. We just so happen to be conveniently located next door to the Veterans Court, and it worked very well working in collaboration. Since 2011, we've had 213 veterans go through the Veterans Block, and the crimes have ranged from everything from OUIs to attempted homicide, and we've had some really good results as a result of their programming. We try to, and we've been successful in having the corrections officers that work in those blocks, or that block, to be combat veterans, so they have a broad understanding of the affliction that can occur from their service. 15 of the incarcerated veterans received deferred dispositions, and the case have been filed, and some real success stories there. Veterans represented service from Vietnam. Individuals have been plagued with alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence charges, for 45 years from the Vietnam era folks to today's individuals that served in Iraq, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and other peacetime locations. Some of the lessons learned from our experience, it's important to take the time to establish strong stakeholder support from the District Attorney's Office, the Judiciary, and law enforcement. If you have that triad working together, much can be accomplished. But any one of those individuals that's not doesn't buy in and see the vision of the Veterans Block in court can pose quite a hurdle to the process. Need to verify D214 accuracy and assure that, as you may know, those that work in corrections, there could be some manipulation going on at times. And I've had some pretty outlandish claims, individuals saying they were Vietnam POWs, sergeant majors, and other positions of importance. And then we get to 214, we realize they did 2.5 years in the National Guard during peacetime. So critically important for the legitimacy of the program to establish that 214 and get a good baseline. Also important to spend some time getting a baseline data set to see just how big the problem is and who's included, who's not, and do you establish a veterans block that takes non-combat veterans? Initially, we did until we had a mass of folks that were able to fill the beds that were combat-related and service-connected. That's a question that needs to be asked locally. Also important to train those criminal justice stakeholders, and I did that through, again, a matter of duty and through the traveling roadshow as to the traumatic brain injury symptoms and signs, post-traumatic stress, and how we convert individuals. The Veterans Block in court need to operate as a system, programming while we're incarcerated, and have a profoundly strong and robust transitional program that works in tandem with the Veterans Administration. And I thought I'd close on a quote that is really timeless. In the last slide, talks about the willingness for which our young people are likely to serve in any war, no matter how justified, shall be directly proportional to how they perceive veterans of earlier wars were treated and appreciated by a nation. And I think that's a lesson in the modern times that we learned from our Vietnam veterans that I think society has it right now. When I came back from Iraq, I flew into Atlanta, and my plane load of troops received a standing ovation. And that makes all the difference in the recovery and the transition home, I think, for veterans. And it's critically important that we recognize that we send men and women off to war. We as Americans have a duty to assist them to transition them back, and we leave no man behind. So thank you for your time.
Well, thank you very much, Major Simone of Ward and Liberty. Super insightful presentation, a lot of information. So thank you both for that. I would like to say, for those of you who signed on a little late, or had to, if you know anybody who left earlier, have colleagues who were interested but could not attend, we will be archiving this webinar on our website, and we'll send out a link later. It'll be on YouTube also. And I also would like to say, too, the Justice Programs Office will be moderating a panel entitled Veterans Treatment Courts Lessons Being Learned at the National Association of Drug Court Professionals Conference at the beginning of next month. And Major Simone will be present on that panel. We talked briefly about it beforehand, but I'm sure he'll be talking about this presentation, the jail class presentation, and also tying in with his other presentations on PTSD and justice-involved veterans. So, yeah, if you're at the conference, be sure to look out for that panel. So at this time, I know we've got some time left. If there's any more questions, feel free to ask. We'll address them as they come in. So thank you.
This is Monica. I just wanted to get started with the first question, which is, do you have any outcomes data on released veteran inmates who have continued to commit crimes?
I do not. We haven't done any recidivism research as of yet at the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office.
In terms of these programs, a lot of them are relatively new. Again, I think 2010 is about the time when most of them came online or thereafter. I will say that the New York program, being one of the longest running, I believe it began in the late 80s in the Arthur Kill Correctional Institute in Staten Island, like in 1987 maybe. They do have some data they collected on recidivism rates, especially for involvement in their programs. So I would recommend that if you want an idea of whether this makes a difference, that may be one place to go since they have the longest running program.
Great, thank you. And I do just want to remind everyone, it looks like we have a lot of attendees who have called in, and if you'd like to ask a question verbally, you can just go ahead and click on the little raise your hand feature, which is in the bottom right of your screen, and we can go ahead and unmute your line and introduce you to ask a question.
This is Kerwin again. I actually have a question for Ward and Liberty. I talked to Major Simone about this briefly at a conference that we went to about a week ago now. In terms of the reception of your Veterans Pod to the rest of the jail population, what was the reception like? And did you give your COs any additional training in terms of how to handle, any perceived, jealousy or any perceived animosity that the non-justice population had towards the Veterans Pod?
We actually, as I mentioned, we had all of the officers were veterans, and so as far as military culture and that sort of thing, they understood it. They were also all graduates of the Crisis Intervention Team training given by NAMI, and that went well. There was a broad understanding. Also, they participated in the matter of duty effort, and so everybody had in our organization, the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office, we joked, but we talked about, we're a veterans advocacy organization that does some law enforcement and corrections, because we did so much community-related fundraising and support and services. We actually had 39 of our own employees that were deployed, and so there's deep understanding of the commitment and duty that we had to assist them. We also spent some time with the inmate population, advising them and the purpose and the objective of the Veterans Block, and it was very well received. We had very little pushback from the other offenders. It went very well with very little pushback, and it was appreciated and adopted throughout the organization of employees.
I think it's worth noting that in my conversations with some of the administrators of the programs, not all correctional officers with military experience may want to participate in a program like this. I had heard about some who objected on the grounds that they didn't feel like incarcerated veterans were representing veterans well, and had opposition to that. And certainly that's one of the reasons why one of the programs I looked at changed from rotating everyone through the veterans pod to making it something that is requested by the officer. So just important to realize that, there are nuances here, specific nuances that should be appreciated. Not everyone's going to love the idea.
That's a great point. And when we initially established the Veterans Block, and there were some non-combat related veterans, there was some of the staff felt there was a concern of legitimacy. The individual served in the 1980s, and it was a non-combat sort of a role, and he committed his crime, and he just happened to be a veteran. So that's something that has to be kind of looked at locally and determined, what is a legitimate entrance standard for each of those blocks.
I know we didn't have time to get into it during the presentations, but Warden Liberty, I think the fly fishing piece of this, it's worth going into, how that had some value. I saw the photograph of the officer, the deputy there with that. Could you expand on that, please?
Sure. So we had Alan Gregory, who's a master fly fisherman and a guide. One of the programs that we did is we taught fly fishing, and we taught fly tying, and as a nice therapeutic hobby that they could assist them in transitioning back. We have a strong support here in the state of Maine for veteran-related outdoor activities. One of the organizations that we partnered with was called A House in the Woods, and Paul and Dee House lost their son. He was killed in Baghdad, and Joel House was his name. And their family had always done guiding, and so as a result, they established House in the Woods, bringing in any veteran and bringing them bear hunting, fly fishing, moose. They actually operate the moose hunt here in the state of Maine for disabled veterans, and so that was a nice transitional way to teach them to fly fish, to tie flies, and then upon release to do a therapeutic sort of activity like fly fishing that can be a redeeming veteran activity with those supporting them.
One other thing I learned about your program there, Warden Liberty, is the noise that was made by the automatic shutting doors and how that
Sure.
was disabled. That's just another unique feature that I think is worth mentioning, because we're not normally, I don't think, sensitive to these issues.
Yeah, so with our heightened awareness and our education regarding post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury, one of the things that we identified that would trigger people was when we automatically unlocked all of the cell doors, there was a rapid fire sounding similar to a machine gun. And that was one of the major triggers. And so we changed our practice there, and we did manual unlocking with a key actually to reduce that. We also reduced we changed the way that we move inmates through the facility, and we reduced the amount of individuals passing through the door that was adjacent to the veterans block. So it reduced the banging, and that the response to the banging and the loud noises allowed more of a therapeutic environment for the veterans.
I'll note that in terms of DD-214s and confirming a veteran status, the Department of Veterans Affairs, especially with their justice outreach programs, has a program called the Veterans Research Search Service, VRSS, which is available for law enforcement jails to verify through a cross-check with the database that they have which inmates have prior military service. And that's something that I think is very worthwhile to look into if you're not already a part of that, because it can help with that problem.
Well, thank you for that. This is Kerwin again. Thank you both for that. I know we've had a couple more questions pop up. One question, what other states or communities have shown interest in starting a program such as this?
Well, I'd look at Florida because they've gone across the board, right? I mean, if we go back to that slide, although it's quite a ways up, I think it's worth going back to. I'm going to go back up to it. Florida has really developed the most programs right now. I believe they have 10 different 10 different prisons and then a few county jails. So 10 prisons, 2 jails, and 1 federal correctional institution have all done specialized housing units. Now, certainly, we should not be thinking that these programs are identical where they've been implemented, because certainly they're different. But Florida has been one of the leading places. Let's take a look at some of the others. Ohio has 4 prisons, if we take a look at that. Trying to zoom in on this. There's 3 jails in California, 3 prisons in Nevada. New York has both prisons and jails. Let's see. 3 prisons in Virginia, 4 prisons and 1 jail in Georgia. In Texas, there's 4 jails and 2 prisons. So I would say, if you're interested in where they're doing this the most, I'd actually look at those states where you have both jails and prisons, because that suggests that the concept, even though you have short-term incarceration versus long-term, there's a recognition of the value even where they're not going to be confined as long. And it might be valuable actually to look at how those programs differ based on those factors.
All right. I know we had another question come up. Second.
The next question we had was, who would you suggest speaking to if I wanted to get a veterans block started in our county jail? And this question comes from a VJO specialist with the VA.
Well, I mean, Kerwin, one of the things you could tell them about why our program exists here. We certainly can try to provide guidance, and we can try to also put individuals in connection with others who have established these programs.
Yes, absolutely. We definitely can put you in touch with, get in touch with these other institutions and get you some information on some guidance on setting up these programs. I know this is something, and again, I talked to Major Simone about it that's something that we kind of want to try and really get into a little bit more about getting some guidance and getting and spreading these jail pods because they're such a positive thing. So getting into more of the technical assistance side and helping give that information on these programs. I know I just received some information from a program I think in Massachusetts somewhere called the acronym is Humvee program that is a little bit older. That has been established for a little while. I'll be sure if anybody's interested, I can send the information on that program too. But we can definitely help anyone out who's looking to start up this program. We can definitely be of assistance with that. So.
Yeah, and it's really important to consider this from the perspective of what happens when a veteran who might otherwise be eligible to participate in a veterans treatment court isn't allowed by virtue of discharge characterization, or maybe it was a violent offense or a felony offense, and the VTC, the Veterans Treatment Court, only takes misdemeanors or nonviolent offenses. A lot of individuals who have needs who would otherwise be eligible are now potentially slipping through the cracks, and it is possible. I think these programs are showing that it's possible to still deliver important treatment to them that could ultimately reduce recidivism and help them get connected with the services they need. So for a substantial population that can't take part in veterans treatment courts, this may be a very viable and important alternative.
Now we have a few more minutes left. If anybody wants to ask any more questions, we're more than available, more than ready to address them. So if anybody else has any more questions, feel free to ask. All right, well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions coming in. But as I said, we will be at the National Association of Drug Court Professionals Conference in Anaheim this year. Warden Liberty will be on our panel. I think the time of the panel, the session is 1:25 on June 1st. So if you'd like to attend that, feel free. Like I said, Major Simone will be on the panel, as well as some other drug court judges, Jack O'Connor, the coordinator for the Buffalo Veterans Treatment Court will be on the panel, as well as Judge Russell. We'll give a lot of different perspectives of where we're at with veterans treatment courts, and we'll definitely be tying in all of our webinars that we've put on in this series into that panel discussion, and hopefully get some good information, some good feedback from it. So once again, on behalf of our office, thank you for attending. If you're in Anaheim at the beginning of the month, we look forward to seeing you. So.